Hey everyone, so today we're going to be talking about the Goryeo Swords Byeolungeom, and this is going to be a quick review of the sword. Now at first I wondered, is there any point to actually doing this review, because this sword is a unique sword, it's the only one of its kind, and also it's got an antique tsuba and the blade's not made to specification, so you can't really buy this exact sword. But I think this review will go to be a testament to Goryeo Swords' production quality and their work, as well as there are other Byeolungeom that you can buy which are similar, but different blades, different tsuba, and there's also the Joseon nobility sword that they offer, which is made to a specification, and every single one of them is more or less the same, and it's based off this sword, but it's a little bit less ornate. So I've actually wanted this sword for quite a long time because I've got some Korean heritage, and so I wanted a Korean traditional sword made in the traditional methods. And so, I looked for quite a long time, and eventually I decided to go for this one. Now, this sword is made in a traditional method for the whole stages, including production. It's not done using modern steel, it's done using Tamahagane. Things are handmade, they're folded, and there's a lot of detail put into it, made by an actual person, not by a robot or a machine. And so this is why I like this sword. Also, the swordsmith Moon Jung-gi, he's actually an apprentice of the Japanese swordsmith Kunimasa Matsuba. And so that came into question for some time, but there was actually a documentary a few years ago showing them together, working together, and Kunimasa was interviewed and asked about Swordsmith Moon, and it shows they got a very clear personal connection with each other, so I actually think that that is a legitimate claim. So let's talk about the historical accuracy of this Byeolungeom. Now, with Korean swords, historical accuracy is quite hard to discern because in Korea, most of the Korean swords were destroyed in the Japanese colonial period. So we've only got a very small sample size to go off, as well as vague writings about them. But thankfully, this sword is based off one that we do have an example of, and that is the Byeolungeom from the Joseon dynasty, and that's now currently kept in a museum. So what is the Byeolungeom? The Byeolungeom is the sword that's wielded by the royal guards on either side of the king. So in the Joseon dynasty, there were only two at a time, and they were mostly decorative swords because it's pretty hard to go in and kill a king. So, you can see why it's quite ornate and it's got really nice fittings, and it's based off that one. And so if you see the scroll work, then it's basically the same as the one in the museum. The only main difference is that the tsuba of that one in the museum is made out of jade, whereas this one's made out of iron, and also the overall length. The one in the museum is 75.5 centimeters, whereas this one here is 107 centimeters. Now, this sword's really interesting because it's got both Korean and Japanese influences. And so I want to talk about the Korean influences first, and then the Japanese influences, and how some of those may still be traditionally Korean. So let's talk about the Korean influences. First up is this tachi style hang with the tidon. And this is a very uniquely Korean thing because it lets it swivel around. So it can be held with the handle to the back so that you can use a bow, and then flip it back around when you want your sword. Now, another traditionally Korean thing about it is that the handle can't be removed. A Japanese sword, you pop out the Makugi pins and the whole thing falls apart and you've got nice pieces of sword. A Korean sword wasn't designed like that. It's designed more like a Western sword, where a sword is a sword. It's not a blade and then the rest of the fittings. And so you can't actually remove the handle and the pieces to separate the blade. It's all one piece. And for some people that's going to be a downside, for other people they'll appreciate the traditional value of that. Now, if you look at the brass scroll work, it almost perfectly matches the one in the museum, the Byeolungeom, and so that's really nicely done, all handmade and lots of detail put into it. Now, one other thing about this one is if you look closely, it has a copper habaki, not a brass habaki. And that's a pretty Korean thing that was done. They used copper instead of brass with habakis for quite some time, and later swapped over to brass habakis. So that's about it for the very Korean. Oh, and also, sorry, there's also the tassel here. So this tassel is really nice. It was done on Korean swords as a remnant from the influence from China rather than the Japanese influence. So this one is nice. So that's about it for the Korean influences. Let's talk about the Japanese influences. So for starters, overall length being 107 centimeters is a very Japanese influence. Korean swords were generally wakizashi length, 70 centimeters, And so this one being really long is Japanese influence, but that actually was taken over in Korea after the Imjin War. During the Imjin War, then Korean soldiers realized that Japanese swords were a lot better in quality, and so a lot of Japanese swords were actually taken and repurposed by Korean soldiers and military. And after that, then they started making swords in that style, seeing it as a better style. And so this is post-Imjin War Korean styled. Another post-Imjin War feature of it would be that it has a bohi. And so that wasn't done on a lot of Korean swords, but after the Imjin War, then a lot of Korean swords that were in high-end production added them on for weight reduction while keeping the structural integrity of them. Same thing for the differential tempering. This one has a hamon. Korean swords generally didn't until they were high-end after Imjin War, then they also started adopting this process, and that's another thing. And also the Tamahagane steel being folded 10 times. Traditionally, Korean steel swords were folded 2 or 3 times because they didn't see a point in it. But after the Imjin War, then they realized that the Japanese folding led to superior construction, and they started folding high-end swords as the Byeolungeom would have been, close to 10 times. And so yes, that's where that influence comes from. Now the other thing is that this is a Shinogizukuri cross-section sword, and Korean swords are typically Shobuzukuri, so it's a minor difference, but some were done, and also some Japanese swords were just taken and repurposed to be Korean swords. So that's where this could still be a Korean sword influence style after the Imjin War. Now the main thing that isn't Korean style at all is that it has a yokote line. So I'm not sure if you can see that, but if you have a look over here, then there's a yokote line where the kissaki has a different cross polish to the rest of the sword. And so that was a very Japanese thing, not done on Korean swords. But it's really aesthetically pretty. I quite like it. So I'm not too fussed about that. But it's good to know that it's not a Korean traditional thing to do. Now another part of the historical accuracy would be the tsuba. So while this tsuba is different from the jade tsuba on the Byeolungeom, this tsuba is actually from the late 1700s to the mid 1800s, sometime during there, and it was on a Korean sword that was likely destroyed in the Japanese colonial period, but the tsuba was kept, and now it's been repurposed for this sword. So it's really cool that you have a piece of history there on your sword, and for historical accuracy, it is history itself, really. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. So for full disclosure, I do have to admit that I did get a discount on this sword. It was originally $2,900 and I got it for $2,200, and that wasn't because they knew I was going to make a review or anything like that. It was because I was looking at another sword that was a unique sword with an antique tsuba that cost $2,200, and then that sword was sold, but I expressed interest into it and they hadn't had time to upgrade and update their English website. And so then they offered me some of these other swords for the same price. So I did effectively get a $700 discount on it. And I promptly paid that all back, plus more, in taxes and red tape and customs. So, that shouldn't affect my review, but I think it's something that you should all know. So let's talk about communication with the seller. Goryeo Swords and I spent months discussing this sword actually, back and forth about different issues, different configurations of it, and also shipping. So when I bought the sword, then they offered me the option of having red rayskin for the handle rather than the wooden handle. That is a traditionally done thing, having rayskin on the handle without the wrap, but I like the wooden handle, so we went with that. We also discussed some engraving. They've done really nice work on the engraving. So you can see that they've got an engraving here. They engraved it, filled it with gold resin, and then painted on the design on top. And so that's really nicely done. And also shipping. So because of coronavirus, shipping was an absolute nightmare. Shipping took months and months to organize because their normal shipping wasn't running because of coronavirus and lots of things. So shipping ended up costing 3 times as much because of coronavirus, and also, there was a lot of issues with shipping. So if you saw the unboxing video, then during their customs in Korea, then it got scuffed over here on the saya. So there's a little bit of a scuff line here where the paint's been ruined. And it's a little bit disappointing, but when it left Goryeo Swords, it was in pristine condition and it wasn't opened in Australian customs, so it must have been damaged in Korean customs. So if you're going to buy a sword from Goryeo Swords, I think having shipping insurance would be a good thing. I'm not sure if their normal shipping option offers that, but their coronavirus stopgap shipping didn't. And They offered to repaint it if I sent it back for free, which was very kind of them because, you know, it wasn't really their fault that any of this happened. But, you know, it doesn't bother me that much, so I'm probably not going to go down that path. But it would have been nice having shipping insurance because then I could just get some of that money back straight away, nice and easily. So definitely consider getting shipping insurance when you buy from them because Korean customs is a little bit rough-handed. So let's talk about what comes in the box. So if you saw the unboxing, you get the sword, you get a really nice sword bag, you get a high quality care kit, and you also get a certificate of authenticity and this sword belt here. And all of those held up really nicely for the past few weeks. I've got no complaints with them. They're very high quality and really well done. The only thing that I modified and don't use anymore is the sword bag, and I'll show you why, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So overall, then, it's a really pretty sword. It's very aesthetically pleasing to look at, really nice brass work, and the whole thing just is a really nice piece to see. And the quality is really good. So with the saya, and there's no rattle, that's the tidon that rattles, but the saya and the blade inside it, no rattle at all. Really nice fit on that. Really nice fit on all of the fittings, and the scroll work has a lot of detail. You can tell that it's handmade because they're not all perfectly cut by a machine. There's enough marks to show it's handmade, but the fit and finish of them is really high quality and it's really nice. Now this tassel here has incredible knot work. You can see that it's all done by hand, very intricate, really nicely done. But what really lets it down is these beads, these plastic beads here. They're of cheap quality, they've got a pretty obvious ridge and a seam, and I'm not pleased with these beads because they've got this incredible workmanship on the sword, the fittings, and also this tassel, and it's all been ruined by these really cheap beads. Now this tassel can be removed so that when you swing the sword you don't have this swinging around, but I just think that Goryeo Swords should have used better quality beads for this. Right, so let's talk about the blade of the sword. The first thing that I noticed when I pulled it out was it's long. It's 76 centimeters long for the blade, and I'm more used to a 70 centimeter blade, so it is really long, and it's also really wide. So the blade width is 36 millimeters at the habaki and 29 millimeters at the kissaki, which is wider than I'm used to. And it just looks like a really big blade. And it also looks really thin and fragile because it's got a very narrow blade angle and basically no niku on the face and only the slightest bit of niku at the edge to stout the edge. So when I held it, I thought it was almost a fragile blade because of the proportions, and I thought it was very thin until I measured it, and it's actually still 7 millimeters thick at the spine, which is pretty normal. And I've also been shown that it is a very strong sword after I've done cutting with it. It's held up to most normal use that I've seen. It also cuts bamboo pretty well. So on the blade then, the fit and finish of the blade is beautiful. It's perfectly straight, there's no wobbling or warpage in the grind, it's perfectly flat, and it's a very high quality polish. It's not mirror and it's not buffed, it's a satiny finish, but you still can see your reflection in it. And it's really pretty to look at. Also the hamon is really nice. It's a very faint, subtle hamon, and it's got a nice irregular pattern, and I really quite like it. So the other thing is the yokote line. On the yokote line, then at the kissaki, then they change the angle that they polish it, so that it gives it a different reflective pattern. And usually you can see the scratch lines on it. On this one, you can't see any scratch lines on it, but it just reflects the light differently. And it's really pretty to look at, really nice to look at, and I quite like it. So with regard to the blade, then it's made using Tamahagane steel, folded 10 times in the traditional Japanese method. And you can see the grain structure of the steel if you look really closely. And it's really nice because it's not like a modern steel where it's just flat piece of steel. The steel has depth and layers to it, and it's subtle, but it's there. So now let's talk about the tsuba. So like I said, it's an antique from the late 1700s to mid 1800s, and it's made out of iron that was clearly handmade. You can see where bits have been forge welded and holes have been drifted and punched, and it's really high quality workmanship, and you can tell it's not done by a machine at all. It was done by hand, and it's an incredible quality of it. It's got a nice finish, it's a patina on it, it's got no wobble, it's flat, it fits well, pretty happy with it. So with the tsuba then, on the back side, there's something interesting. There's some straight line scratches on it, and I'm not sure if that's because it was from a sword and the orientation of the original sword was that it was flipped the other way round, or if that's just damage from when it was off a sword in storage before it came onto this sword. Either way, I don't think we'll ever know, but it's a cool piece that's got some detail to it. Now it's also really nice to have this because it's a piece of history there on the blade, and it really makes the sword a unique, one-of-a-kind sword because you can't replicate it. You can never have another sword that is made like this one because you can't go back 200 years and make an exact same one of this and mass produce it. So that's something really nice. So now we get onto the handle. The handle is interesting because, as you can see, it's got no wrap on it. It's just wood that's been lacquered and the scroll work. And so the handle is very wide, and it's also very slender. And that makes it an interesting handle because it's quite different from my other swords where they've got a wider, thinner handle that fits and takes up more space in your hand. This one doesn't actually take up much space in your hand. And when I swung it the first few times, when you see the cutting videos, you'll see that the first couple of swings were it took me a bit to get used to it because it didn't fit on my hands like I expected other swords to. But it quickly corrected itself and it's become really nice to hold. It fits in my hands really well. And I've got size 7 hands, so if you've got smaller hands, you might want to talk to Goryeo Sword and they can make the handle slimmer for you, thinner for you, so it fits nicely in your hands. Now I was worried that because it's a wooden lacquered handle, it might be slippery and that I wouldn't have a good grip on it. I personally haven't had a problem with that, but my hands don't sweat very much. So if yours sweat a lot, you might consider getting the raised skin wrap and that might be better grip. This one for me though has been no problems. I was also worried about the scroll work because it does cover where you hold it in your hands and that would be a problem and it would make it basically unusable. After swinging the sword, then it's definitely usable. The first 50 swings were no problem, no irritation to my hands. After the first 100 swings, then my hands started getting sore. But you know, after a week, then built up calluses and I swing it 100 to 200 times, no problems. I also never got cut or any particular blisters. It was just a little bit of irritation on my hands, just a little bit sore. But you know, that quickly got resolved within a week basically. So the handle also has a really nice curve that follows the blade. And it really makes it nice to hold. You can tell where the blade is. Really nice for edge alignment. You know exactly where your edge is. So I think it's a really nice handle that I've come to appreciate and get used to. And I'm not sure if I can go back to using a wrapped handle the same anymore. So now let's talk about handling of the sword. The sword handles fantastically. In terms of dimensions, it's 107 centimeters in the sheath, 104 centimeters out of the sheath, 76 centimeters blade length, and also the point of balance is about 14 centimeters from the tsuba, as you can see. And for a 76 centimeter blade length, 14 centimeters from the tsuba is actually quite close. And I think that probably has to do with the scroll work on the handle. And because the point of balance is so close, it handles really well. You got no problem stopping it, changing directions and moving on. But also because it's such a wide blade, it's still got a lot of authority in the cut. It's also only 1080 grams, so it's quite a light blade. I would feel pretty comfortable using this one-handed, but also it's got enough weight and heft so that it doesn't feel odd using it two-handed. So you know, it's really enjoyable to use. You can do a lot of things with it. It doesn't handle like a Western sword, definitely handles like an Asian sword despite the close point of balance, as well as the scroll work acting sort of like a pommel, but it's just like a more maneuverable katana, and it handles really nicely, really enjoyable to cut with, and you'll see that in the cutting demonstrations. So with the cutting, then I first started it. The first 2 cuts were a bit off because it was just a different blade to use, and it quickly corrected itself. The cuts after that were all really nice to do, very straight cuts, very clean cuts. It's a very sharp blade. I wouldn't want to run my hand over it because the edge has a bite to it. It's a really nice edge. No secondary bevel, it's basically primary bevel and the tiniest bit of nuka at the edge. Then I tried it with the split noodle to see how it would hold up to that, and it passed that test brilliantly. It's got a lot of authority in the cut, a lot of speed in the cut, and it's incredibly sharp. Now for freestanding cuts, also works really well, as you can see. But I'm not an expert in Tameshigiri, so I use pool noodles because you've seen me cut pool noodles, so it's a good reference point for my cutting. But who is an expert is the research and developer swordmaker Moon. He has his own YouTube channel, Moon He1. He's a 7th Dan in Iaido, and before he sent the sword to me, he did a cutting demonstration on green bamboo with it, and so you can see that there. So as you can see, beautiful sword, incredible cutting power, cuts pool noodles, bamboo, cuts probably tatami mats really well as well. I haven't had a chance to try it yet because tatami mats are incredibly hard to get in my country, but if I do, I'll definitely give it a go and I'll film that and let you guys all see. So let's talk about the issues of the sword. First big one is customs handling. Customs being rough and scratching the sword really shouldn't happen, especially on a 4,450 AUD sword. It just really isn't appropriate for customs to do that to your blade, and so definitely get insurance for it. But it's not the fault of Goryeo Swords, it's definitely Korean customs. Now what is the fault of Goryeo Swords is these beads on the tassel. The beads they let the whole thing down. It's like you've got this incredible sword, incredible tassel, and then cheap beads. Beads can't be that expensive. They really should use better beads than that. It just takes away from the whole thing. Now the next big drawback is the price. If we just talk about the sword, then $2,200 US, it's pricey. That's not including shipping, not including the taxes you pay on it. So that's a big consideration. And is it worth it for that price? Well, we'll go through that later. So another issue is that you can't take apart the handle and the blade. So it makes polishing, cleaning, sharpening all a little bit more difficult because you've got the handle and the tsuba in the way. But that's historically accurate, so can't really complain about that. You either like the historical accuracy or you are bothered that you can't do those things easier. Another thing is that the belt had a few holes, but it was still quite wide for me. I'm a pretty skinny guy, so I had to add 2 more holes. If you're a lady or a skinny guy like I am, you might need to add some holes, and it costs a little bit more to add these eyelets in as well. But yeah, it's nice that the belt is this long though, because you can put it around your shoulder and have it as a back carry. Now the final issue that I come to is the sword bag. So this is their sword bag. It's really nice quality, high quality, really nice design, but it's just a tube. So when you fit your sword in, then the tidon and the belt have to be taken off. Well, the tidon doesn't, but the belt does, because it just won't fit inside and you can't carry it like this. So to remedy this, I made my own sword bag. So as you can see, it's got the same design for the bottom half, but then it splits so that this part can stay outside. And then the handle can be wrapped up by this, and it's got a little flap that folds over and buttons up here. And so in that way, then you can carry your sword using the sword belt and the tidon, and it can just hang in the sword bag, and then you can just pull it off. So having a sword bag design like this is a good idea. It took me 1 day to make it, and in terms of parts it was about $20, and it's a nice high quality fabric, nice print. So maybe Goryeo Swords should design a bag and have a bag like this so that it can be used with their tidon, or if you buy a sword like that, it doesn't take much effort to make one of these. So overall we get to the big question: is the Goryeo Byeolungeom worth it? Because it's a very expensive sword. And I think that's a question that has to be answered individually. Do you want the traditional aspect of it, or do you just want a really nice functional sword? Because if you want a really nice functional sword, I would say no, it's not worth it, because you're paying a lot of money for handmade scroll work like this, antique tsuba, and also for a Tamahagane blade that's been folded over. You know, they make their own steel, they do their own folding. It's a very costly process. And so the money is spent in these traditional aspects rather than in the performance. And performance-wise, it does fantastically, but you're paying a lot more for it than you should. Because if you want a really nice performing modern steel blade without all of this ornate work, you can definitely get one for a lot cheaper. But if you like the traditional aspect and you want a Korean sword that's made from traditional steels, traditional processes, and you want all of this handmade stuff done by a Korean master smith with a team of Korean workers who do it all by hand rather than relying on plasma cutters and the like, then this is a really good sword. And also you help the Korean artisans to keep the business alive and keep them in a job and working so that this doesn't die out. So for me, then this was definitely well worth it. You know, even though it was very pricey, it was worth it because of the traditional aspect of it and the value that you get there that, you know, can't really be measured in money. You can't measure the skill of the smith and the handiwork and also making their own steel in modern times in money, because it doesn't translate to value in terms of practical use. It translates to traditional, sentimental, cultural value. And so 4,450 AUD, yes, pricey, but I would be happy to pay that. But if you want a nice performing sword, then maybe go for something made out of modern steel. So the Goryeo Swords is a really nice sword in terms of handling, fit finish, the aesthetics of it, and also its cutting performance. It's well above average. It's a very high tier, really nicely done sword where they've put a lot of care and effort into it and they haven't cut corners. So, you know, the price does reflect that, and the price is worth it depending on what you want, or it might not be worth it if that's not what you're looking for. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this review of the Korean Goryeo Swords Byeolungeom, and with that, I'll see you next time.